Hi everyone, welcome back. We are about ready to start Module 3 this week, and that module is going to focus on the creation of the message and the medium by which we deliver the message. Last week we looked at theories from the perspective of the communicator, and this week we're going to look at theories about how we formulate the message and the medium by which we deliver communication. So let's go ahead and just jump right over to Module 3 and get started. You will see your readings, your video, your PowerPoint, and we'll talk a little bit about your activities this week because you do have a couple activities. So here we are in Module 3. I took the PowerPoint out already so we can look at it much bigger, and we'll get started. So we are concerned this week with theories surrounding the message and the media. So let's start with the message first. When we deliver a message, obviously, how we put our thoughts into messages is through language, through words. But we do not just have words to communicate, we also have nonverbal communication. And we have to consider both aspects of the message, both verbal and nonverbal, when we create and send messages. So I think it's fitting that the chapter starts with nonverbal communication. Now, what is nonverbal communication? Well, of course, hopefully you know it as any communication that does not involve words. And that's a pretty broad definition, but that's exactly what nonverbal communication is. And it encompasses many, many areas. I'm just going to skip ahead to our next slide and introduce you very quickly to some areas of nonverbal communication that we should take into consideration when we plan and deliver messages. Certainly, we have kinesics, that is the study of movement and gestures. Haptics is the study of touch as communication. Chronemics looks at the use of time as communication. Proxemics is the study of space as communication. You have our physical appearance, which includes everything from our clothing to our body type to artifacts. And finally, vocalics. And vocalics is our vocal. Anything that accompanies your words but is not actually a word. It's also often called paralanguage, and it includes things such as the tone of our voice, the pitch of our voice, how fast we talk or how slow, all of the vocal elements, again, that are not actually words. So hopefully you're familiar with some of these nonverbal areas of communication, because our nonverbal communication serves some critical functions when we send messages. And one of the first functions you see right up there is that nonverbal communication can be an exact substitute for words. And this is mostly through gestures. We do have gestures that basically need no interpretation. They need no words whatsoever. We actually call those types of gestures emblems. They are a direct replacement for speech. Some of the more knowable emblems in our culture, thumbs up, of course. You have of course, the okay sign, stop, and we have another gesture that needs no words. It's the read between the lines gesture, and many, many more. Anytime you have a gesture that is an exact substitute for a word, we also call that an emblem. I would say it's not just gestures. Certainly, someone can look across the room and give you that look. That means it's time to go. And you know exactly what they mean just from their eye contact or their facial expression. So we have lots of ways that nonverbal can substitute for our actual words. Nonverbal communication can also supplement our verbal or complement it. It goes along with it. We call gestures that go along with our communication or complement our language illustrators. And oftentimes when we are talking, we use gestures to complement what we're saying. It was just such a huge problem, I couldn't even imagine what to do. And when I do it like that in the video, it seems a little stilted and planned, but you all know you've been in everyday conversations where you're gesturing and moving and making facial expressions that all complement what you're already saying. And the most interesting one here next is contradiction. Yes, our nonverbal communication can contradict verbally what we are saying. And interestingly enough, if the two do come into conflict or contradiction, you should probably believe the nonverbal communication. It is often more accurate. So, for instance, I grew up a lot with my mom telling me, fine, go out, do whatever you want, see if I care. Now, I'm pretty sure I heard, fine, go out, do whatever you want. And I did. But of course, everything in the nonverbal side of her message was contradicting what she was actually saying. And she was telling me, I care and I don't want you to go out. So certainly we always have that. I'll tell people, if your significant other, you ask them how they are and they say, I'm fine, totally fine. They're not fine. They may be saying one thing, but the nonverbal is certainly contradicting. And finally, we can use nonverbal communication to emphasize or overemphasize a certain point or idea that we're saying. So certainly when I get excited for someone, I may start jumping up and down with them, emphasizing how happy I am. Or if I say something like, I just have one more point I want to get across, I'm really emphasizing certain words with the nonverbal aspect. So those are some functions we use nonverbal communication for. I already mentioned emblems are direct substitutes for words. Illustrators complement. And we have two other words down here. We have adapters. Adapters are an interesting set of nonverbal communication because we can draw meaning from them, but I'm not sure that we're supposed to, because adapters are often unconscious behaviors that are serving maybe some type of, we say, bodily function. What we mean by that is some people might play with their hair and twirl it, and they may not even realize they're doing it. And if you're like me and a people watcher, I just get obsessed, like, stop twirling your hair, stop twirling your hair. And that's all I can look at. I don't know, the twirling of the hair. They could be anxious, they could be bored, it could be a comforting behavior. We don't really know, but it's probably serving some function for the person. This is also like scratching an itch. I often, when I saw a student do something like this in class or stretch up like this in class, I'd look at him and say, adapter or question? And yes, I'm a little bit of a dork that way. But what I was trying to get at, are you just stretching or do you really have a question that you're trying to ask? So adapters are, again, often unconscious, but they serve some kind of function for us. And the last word you see there is affect displays. Affect displays are our facial expressions. And we do communicate a lot through the face. The face is one of the biggest channels of nonverbal communication. We know that you can even go anywhere in the world and we have 6 facial expressions that are universally recognized. Those are happiness, sadness, fear, anger, disgust, and surprise. You don't even need the words. You can see it and read it all right on the face. So we have to consider both the verbal and the nonverbal when we are sending messages. And since we've talked about the nonverbal, let's move over to the verbal. Our actual language shapes the way we think. Our language shapes our perceptions and our realities and even our behaviors, believe it or not. We call this linguistic relativity, and it's often also known as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. And to show you how language shapes our culture and how we think, I have a short video that I think explains it best that we'll watch.
In the 1930s, the linguist Benjamin Lee Whorf proposed what is now known as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. Whorf, influenced by his mentor Edward Sapir, theorized that the way we read, write, and speak could influence and even control the ways we think about the world, as well as our abilities and our behaviors. While the hypothesis has faced skepticism, it's been tested in numerous experiments over the years, and researchers have confirmed that our languages are sometimes associated with differing skill levels at certain tasks. One such example is telling apart colors. Our knowledge of the various colors might seem obvious, but some languages have no separate words for colors like blue and green. Instead, the same word is used for both colors, and this does affect people's ability to tell these colors apart. Speakers of the Zuni language consider orange and yellow to be the same, and they have a harder time telling apart shades of orange-yellow. The hypothesis is further supported by the directional skills of Australian Aboriginal speakers of the Kuuk-Taieri language. In Kuuk-Taieri, there are no terms for directions like left or right. Instead, this is described using north, south, east, and west. Therefore, speakers of the Kuuk-Taieri must remain constantly aware of their own directional orientation in a way that English speakers are not. These people can tell which way they're facing at all times, even in unfamiliar buildings. Their language has required this since they learned to speak. Keith Chen, an economic professor at Yale, theorized that the influence of language could be even more far-reaching in its effects on our behavior. He recalled how, when talking about an uncle, the Chinese language requires speakers to specify their exact relationship, whereas the English language allows speakers to use the same word for any uncle. Unlike English speakers, the Chinese speakers would have to remember these precise differences. Chen suspected that certain features of languages could also shape how we think about and plan for the future. What if some of us had to remember the difference between the present and the future, but others didn't? This is an important distinction among many languages. Their grammar either requires us to tell the future apart from the present, or it doesn't. English is what's called a futured language. To talk about the future, we have to say, it will be cold tomorrow, rather than it is cold today. We can't just say it is cold tomorrow. But futureless languages like Finnish allow people to use constructions like today be cold or tomorrow be cold. They can say be cold about the present or the future. Chen predicted that when a language treats the present and future as the same, we might start acting like the future is no different from the present and consider it to be just as important as the current moment. We might be willing to make trade-offs in the present for the benefit of our future. Conversely, if we see the future as something very separated and distant, we might be more inclined to disregard consequences. To test his theory, Chen gathered data from surveys spanning 76 developed and developing countries in 5 continents. He compared households with the same income, family structure, educational levels, and religious beliefs. They only differed in their language. His findings were astounding. Speakers of futured languages like English saved money only 69% as often as speakers of futureless languages like Finnish. The futureless speakers saw the future as equally important and valued saving up for the years ahead. Even when Chen controlled for a country's GDP, growth rates, interest rates, and unemployment, their language was the strongest predictor of saving or spending behavior. And futured speakers ultimately had 39% fewer retirement assets. These effects also weren't just cultural or regional. In countries where people speak both kinds of languages, the difference still remained. In Switzerland, where 3 languages are spoken, futured speakers still save money only 36% as often as their futureless neighbors. And on a national scale, countries with futureless languages saved 6% more of their GDP yearly. These patterns even extended to healthy and unhealthy habits. Featured language speakers were less likely to use condoms or birth control, 24% more likely to smoke, and 29% less likely to be physically active. They were also 13% more likely to be obese, incurring a number of additional health risks. For them, the burden of responsibility today wasn't worth the benefit of a better future. The impact of their choice is very real. People over 60 who smoke are at an 83% higher risk of death. Even those who smoke and then quit are 34% more likely to die. And an inactive lifestyle can be just as deadly. 1 out of every 10 deaths in the world occurs due to being sedentary. Like many respondents who spoke a featured language, these amount to 5.7 million deaths every year, the unexpected effect of something as simple as language. Chen's research showed that even seemingly insignificant features of our languages can have a massive impact on our health, our national prosperity, and the very way we live and die.
Okay, I think that says more strongly than I could the impact of language. And of course, it shapes completely how we think about our world. I would often say to students, think about something you don't have a word for. And it becomes very interesting because you can't. Your language so permeates and shapes how you think, and that is linguistic relativity. Another theory that follows up on that is the social construction of reality. And Berger and Thomas basically continued this research and said we make sense of our world through language. And not only does our particular language and the words that we know and the way we speak influence that, the people using the language also shape our reality. And this is the notion that meanings are not found in things, but in people. So we may know a definitional aspect of a word, but ultimately that's rarely what we're thinking of when we hear a word. You may have heard two words that we often throw out, denotation and connotation. Denotation is a dictionary definition, but most of the time, as people, we're operating in a connotative reality, and that is a personal meaning reality. So we do this exercise in class where I have students draw an ugly insect or spider or snake, something they're scared of. I also have them draw their least favorite food. And then finally, on another third piece of paper, I have them write what they call their mom, which typically is M. And we'd say, put the first sheet of paper on the floor, stomp that ugly insect, get rid of it, kill it. And I say, put that horrible food on the floor, stomp it, get rid of it. And then I say, put your mom on the floor, stomp her, get rid of her. And of course, as you might have guessed, the room usually stops. And the majority of the people refuse to put mom on the floor and stomp her. And I say, wait, it's just an M, an O, and an M on a piece of paper. Language is completely arbitrary. Why? No, put her on the floor, stomp her. And they can't do it. They said, it's my mom. And if there is somebody still stomping their mom at that point, it gets a little bit hairy and I have to try to figure out what's going on. But certainly that's how powerful, again, we take and turn words into meanings, and that further constructs our social reality. So I often say in class, your perception is your reality. And I hate when people don't take that seriously. If you perceive it a certain way and you act on those perceptions, then that's your reality. So if you perceive tall men as threatening, just go with that for a minute. Sorry, tall guys. You perceive them as threatening. So you actively stay away from tall men. Your perception is, in fact, changing your reality and your behaviors. So when somebody says to you, that's just your perception, they're really trying to blow you off and say, yeah, that's just what you think and you're wrong. It's not actually a great thing to say. It's people think it's a way to soothe things over, but your perception is your reality at the point that you act based on that reality. So not only does our language construct the way we think, the actual language itself, but how we use and attach meanings to that language further constructs our reality. All right, we have one last theory here that talks about language use. And Kenneth Burke is a theorist you will run into a lot in communication. He was a very important theorist, and we're going to talk about some of his ideas, which you might think are a little more out there. But we'll start with the first part of the theory, which is the theory of identification. And this also looks at things, I think, from a persuasive stance. If I can identify with you in some way, then I can relate to you and even get you to behave and do things in a certain manner. So there's three prongs. I first have to identify with you. How do I do that? How do I relate to college students anymore? I don't know how I do it. I try to stay up on certain things. I try to tell interesting stories. Yeah, That's the substance. I use language to try to create a story or meaning with students. So I can tell the story about problems I had with my roommate. Sophomore year was pretty much the worst ever. And one morning I was so exasperated and tired of my roommate, I lost it. And I said one of those things you shouldn't say, but I just couldn't help it. And that blew the whole thing apart. Maybe I'll tell you the rest of the story later if you want to know. But what I'm trying to do is identify through telling this story about my college roommate with you, my audience who's in college, and that may lead you to behave in certain ways or think in certain ways. And that's what Burke said we need to do. Okay, just to end suspense, I had a roommate who had her self-esteem was every morning we had to go through, do I look okay? Oh, I look fat, I look awful, blah, 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 and I'd always say, you look great, you're beautiful, and reassure her. And just that morning, I couldn't do it. She just, why do you keep asking me? You don't listen to me anyway. So I looked at her and I said, you know what? You are fat. I do not recommend this, not competent communication. And we were no longer roommates after that. And that's the interesting thing. I did not use language or substance that she could identify with. As a matter of fact, it was the complete opposite. And that instance, that substance and identification or anti-identification led to action, us moving out on each other. We know that similarity tends to attract people. So we look for ways we can relate to people. So if I can notice something, I love good salespeople will do this. If you're wearing a certain brand or you have a baseball hat on for a certain team, the first thing they'll do is go, oh, you're a Dodgers fan. I'm a Dodgers too, fan. They don't even have to be a Dodgers fan. It doesn't matter. If they say they are, through that language, through that story, through that identification, you already like them better. And you can probably persuade them more now. So it's very intriguing. I would tell again that we sometimes when we meet someone we really like and we click or we hit it off or we have something in common. And I say, oh, I love listening to the Lumineers. They're like, oh my gosh, that's my favorite band too. And it's like, whoa, right? Okay, full overreaction there. And then I say, oh, do you also listen to Cage the Elephant? And they're like, they don't want to say no, right? Because if they say no, we lose a little bit of that connection or that identification. So you will even lie to keep that identification and substance going. You might say something like, oh yeah, I've heard of them too. And it's like, no, you haven't. But what you don't want to do is break that connection. And we identify and connect with people through our language, which is substance. And when we do that, it can lead to action. So that's Burke's theory of identification. Has another theory that ties in a little bit, and that is what I am going to call the principle of perfection theory. So go with me here. First of all, Burke says when we're young, we hear a lot of negatives. One of the first words that we might hear is no. No. And if you think about a small toddler, they hear no an awful lot, or don't touch that, don't do this, don't do. And so he says we're already ingrained with the negative at a young age, that we're not enough, or we can't do this, or we can't do that. And that affects us, who we are as a person. He says further in society, we have two other problems called the principle of hierarchy, where we've always got to move up through the hierarchy. We're never good enough. So he says, we're always reaching for more. And I think there's something to it. Even after you get a promotion, you can feel good for only so long, because then you've got to get to the next rung on the hierarchy, and we're forever just trying to move ahead, kind of stuck in this endless loop. He also says we're also trying to be perfect all the time, which we can never be. And it is this struggle for perfection, again, that is going to get us in trouble. because we can never be perfect. And if you look at this, I can give you an example. I know some women feel like they face this struggle and it affects them deeply. This principle of perfection, that I am supposed to look a certain way and wear certain clothes and say certain things, and I'm never going to be good enough to whatever the media portrays, or whatever it might be. So Burke says this is inherent in all of us, that we all have this principle of perfection, or what he even calls it is that we are all rotten with perfection and we can never achieve. And because we can never achieve it and we've been told all these things we can't do, we feel guilty. And the only way to rid ourselves of this guilt is to purge it somehow. And Burke would argue that we purge our guilt through communication, that we have to talk about it and purge it to get rid of it and move forward. And there are two ways that we can purge our guilt. We can purge that through what he says, victimage or mortification. And I will fix the word victimage for you, as I see it's missing, it's a G. Victimage means we try to move the guilt and blame it on somebody else to make ourselves feel better. And this is, I find, funny when we talk about this. I usually do this with exams. I often find if students do really well on an exam, who do they credit? You credit yourselves. If you do really terrible on an exam and you never studied or even watched that video, who do you blame? Me, the teacher. Victimage. You have to feel better about yourself, so you're purging your guilt out on me and saying it was my fault. So certainly that does happen. The other one is mortification. And this is when people certainly then take on and try to carry all that guilt themselves without purging it. And I think you could see, Burke would say this is very detrimental to someone because it could greatly affect their self-esteem, their language use, and everything about their identity. So he says we must purge our guilt in some way. So his theory over here that I call the principle of perfection is very interesting. I would encourage you to definitely take some time to read about this one in the book. It was one of the first theories of communication that I really thought, whoa, this guy was out there. And it actually got me very interested in studying more theory because I did think there was something to it. Probably being raised Catholic, I also related, which Burke was, by the way, incidentally. And I understood this all consuming of everything in life rolling around this guilt and having to purge and talk about it constantly. I mean, if in the Catholic faith, you even have to go to confession to purge your guilt. So some very interesting parallels there if you'd like to check out more about it. It's time for us, though, to move on. We'll talk about one last communication messaging strategy, how you form messages. Remember, we're talking about forming messages and using words in ways that affect people and others. And compliance gaining is exactly that, using certain messages to get people to basically act or comply with how you want them to. Marl and Schmidt came up with all kinds of different compliance gaining strategies. And you have an activity where you are actually going to pick what compliance gaining strategies or messages work best on you to get you to comply. So you'll be filling that out. And while there are some 20 different strategies on the handout, most all of those strategies break down into 5 types or 5 clusters of strategies. So the first one is rewarding. You all know this one. If you watch this video, I will reward you with another story. Not a big enough reward, I'm sure. But if you find the reward big enough or good enough, you would comply. So we often use rewards. Punishing. And a lot of people say, we don't like this one. No, actually, people don't like punishment to comply, but unfortunately, it is very effective. I know parents who will say, I'm never punishing my child. I'm going to discipline all their behavior through rewarding. Good luck with that. There's a reason punishing works, okay? Punishing gets people to comply. And we know this from the Milgram studies. I don't know if you have heard of them. They're very famous psychological studies. If you take a course in persuasion, you will probably talk about them, where they basically got people to continue to punish someone based off of a scientist saying, please continue to do so. And that's going to pull into expertise. And I'm going to talk about expertise next. But punishment, especially from a legitimate authority, can be very persuasive to get you to act. Expertise, let's talk a little bit about this Milgram studies, is someone you believe has some kind of power or authority over you. They have some kind of expertise, so you won't question them. So in the Milgram studies, this man, just a Confederate, posed as a scientist, even though he was not. It's just an ordinary Confederate running the experiment where someone was told to continue shocking another person. And the people continued to do it. They listened to the man in a lab coat simply because he said, please go on. And it was astounding to find out that legitimate authority or even expertise is very compelling. And so we tend to listen to experts. I know even doctors sometimes, it's interesting to me how much we pay attention and don't question what they say. So certainly expertise is very influential. And then we have impersonal commitments. Impersonal commitments appeal to kind of a higher moral message. If you do this, if you come help me volunteer, you'll feel really good about yourself. And I think these are great persuasive messages. Everyone would be so proud of you if you did this. You'll look like a star for helping. These are these impersonal commitment messages that appeal to a moral sense. Personal commitments, however, appeal to debt, that someone owes you something. I helped you move last time, you owe me now. That's a personal commitment. They're focused by debt type messages, whereas impersonal commitments really try to call you to a more moral or higher standard. So when you do the compliance gaining activity, you're going to get to see all these different types of messages, and they're written out for you too, how you would say it and what kind of strategy you would use to get someone to comply. And you're going to be marking those as to what would be effective on you, what would work, and what wouldn't. Let's go ahead and turn now to the medium, not the message anymore. We've talked a little bit about some verbal and nonverbal theories about how both those types of communication shape our lives. But now we want to look at the medium or the channel. And in this sense, we really turn to a lot of mass media theories. And that's probably the most important channel in our lives right now. If you think of it, everything seems to have some kind of mediated communication today. This very Zoom video is media. So the first theory here is cultivation theory. And Berger was very concerned with the amount of television that people were watching and how that television was basically changing people's realities about the world. He basically said you have heavy viewers of media, people who are on media all the time. And his way of defining a heavy viewer was someone who watched TV more than 4 hours a day. And I'll talk to you about that because guess what? Another one of your activities is going to be keeping track of how much media you view. Now, what do I mean by media versus TV? Well, all of it is media. So you're going to be keeping track for a few days of anything that is media related that you tune into. So this could be Netflix, Amazon Prime, Hulu, Disney, Apple TV, anything you watch, whether it's on your phone or a television or a computer. That also includes your social media time. How much time do you spend on Instagram or Facebook or Snapchat or TikTok? Endless hours on TikTok, right? How much time are you spending in media use? Media use also includes gaming and games that you play. That's all media use. So I'm asking you for a couple of days to track how much time do you spend on media? And are you a heavy viewer? At this point, if you were to include your school and Zoom sessions and videos, I'm not sure you could help but come out to be a heavy viewer because that's somewhat the world we're living in. One of the things that also surprised me was students now, your student group watches a lot of YouTube, just hours of YouTube. That mystifies me a little bit, but you love watching YouTube. So anything that is media. All right, so what Gerbner said is the heavier of a viewer you are, the more distorted your perception of reality is. You don't know what reality is really like because the media has basically infiltrated you and started changing your perceptions. So, what happened in some of his original studies is crime reports, for instance. If you watch a lot of crime dramas, people started to overestimate how much crime was actually occurring in their own neighborhoods. And so this became fascinating to Gerbner that people would spend all this time watching media and not be able to have it reflect on what was actually happening in society. He also called this the mean world syndrome because people often believed that the real world was much, much meaner than it was, than it in fact was, that there was much more crime, much more hatred, all these other things were happening, and the world was a very mean place um, to be. And mainstreaming also looks at when people become and believe much more similarly than they otherwise might. So here's an example of mainstreaming. I put the CSI article in here because a lot of people are watching CSI shows. I think we had like, I don't know, 4 or 5 different CSI shows, right? So if your perception of reality is distorted, you begin to think, well, everybody is a crime scene investigator and a forensic scientist is the hottest job out there. No, it's on such a smaller scale than what media is portraying to you. And people were even judges and juries were asking for crime scene analysis in courtrooms that they'd seen on TV that didn't actually exist in reality yet because the media had so changed and biased their own reality of what was real in the world. So that's cultivation theory. It's talked about in your text, and how the media can actually get us thinking about the world in a way that does not depict reality. Most of you probably already know that the media is a very powerful source. And I don't think that anyone is delusional about agenda setting theory, that the media does tell us what to think about. And if you have not watched The Social Dilemma, speaking of watching things, I would encourage you to watch The Social Dilemma. It's a documentary on Netflix about the agenda setting of not just media, but social media in particular. And if you've ever wondered where you can go and Google something, what happened the other day? Oh, I had Googled rugs. I was looking for a new rug for the living room. Guess what popped up in my Facebook feed? All kinds of rug sale at Wayfair, West Elm Rugs. I was like, how did they know? How did they know? Even my son could be looking for something, and whatever he's looking for will pop up on my feed. So what's happening is the social media is pushing our buttons like never before. They're tracking everything we're looking at and then putting ads right towards us that we know we can't resist. So agenda setting theory takes, right there and says, yes, the media is telling us what to think about and how to act. So we start with the pseudo environment. Your book defines the pseudo environment as this notion that we don't respond to actual events. We respond to nice stories and pictures in our heads that we want to think about. And the way I really teach this is a pseudo environment is a cute story that's not really news. It's a feel good story. And because it's the kind of story we want to hear, we're more likely to tune in. And it's not actually even important. So if you've ever heard kind of a preview on the news, see what happened to the pandas at the zoo today, tune in at 10. Well, what happened to the pandas? The pandas are cute and furry. I like them. I'll tune in. Or, you know, uh, veteran and dog are reunited after time apart. Tune in at 11 for the story. It's like, oh, I want to see a reunion. I'm probably one of the biggest fans on social media of a site called The Dodo. And if you know it, you can go look it up. They're animal stories, and I get sucked into them every single time because I love watching these animal stories. It's nice pictures in my head and furry, happy animal stories. That's not news. It's not news. It is what is called a pseudo environment, but the media knows they can get us to tune into it. And so these are used in, I mean, they're used in the Olympics. They were used in American Idol, where we get these fuzzy, wonderful backstories that have nothing to do with the actual competition or whatever we're watching, but it gets us to watch because we want to hear that happy, fuzzy story. All right. Agenda setting in the media, they have all this stocked and ready to go, and that's called priming. And they basically keep feeding out those stories to us, one right after the other. It's the same on social media as well. Gatekeeping. Gatekeeping really is this notion of the media chooses what we hear about and what we don't. If any of you aspire to work in PR, it's a fascinating field. I worked in public relations for a while, and we kept wondering, what do we have to do to get our story in the news? Because I worked for an agency and we were trying to get free news, basically come cover us, come see what we're doing. It's so wonderful. And I would send out press releases to all the different media agencies. And I tell you what, it totally depended on whether it was a slow news day or a big news day. If something big was breaking in the news, there is no hope you're going to get any kind of new coverage. If it's a slow news day, they might come out and show you, Astro, the talking aardvark. The media is a gatekeeper. They decide what you get to see and what you don't get to see. So gatekeeping is this idea of controlling. And then, of course, agendas. And in your text, in the theory, we say there's three types of agenda. The very first one is the agenda of the media. And they do have an agenda for showing you what they want to show you. And most of it's revolving around money. So who's endorsing them? Who's giving money? What's the network? All of that is part of the media's agenda. They do look at the agenda of the public, and I think that's why we get a lot of this pseudo environment story, because they know what the public wants versus what the public doesn't want to see. And of course, the media also considers policy, and policy implications absolutely 100% are controlled by our media. You can see that having happened with cable news and direct political viewpoints that have spun off into separate media. So now you can watch whatever kind of news you want to hear. And this is what has made the notion of quote unquote fake news impossible. Because if everybody is feeding you their own view and gatekeeping the other view out, how can you really know? Look at how much language shapes your perception. Media shapes your perception of reality. So certainly you have to understand the power of the media you're watching and the medium it's coming through. And your book talks a little bit about who are the powerful media players and who's not as powerful, and what type of medium are you viewing. Our last theory. Are you excited? It's our last theory. Our last theory is also a medium theory. And this one says that we get to act on the media, that we aren't just sitting by and the media is telling us what to think and what to do. This uses and gratification theory by Katz says we act on the media and we turn to the media for our needs, which is great because the media knows that. And there are certain what he calls gratifications we get from turning to the media, or gratifications we get from checking in on our Instagram or YouTube. The first one is entertainment. We do turn to the media for entertainment. And I think right now with quarantine, many people have turned to Netflix and some of the TV show stations for entertainment. I know I have. It's like, "Ugh, we've been watched that already. When's the new season coming out?" Because at the beginning of quarantine, just spent needed to entertain ourselves. All right. We also do turn to the media for information. We do want to get information. Again, I mentioned in agenda setting theory the bias of all the different media. Um, Interestingly enough, I mean, even Wikipedia is biased because anybody can go in there and change or write something. Is Google biased? Sure, absolutely. Um, it's very, very difficult in today's age to figure out where you turn for information and is that information truly objective. But we need information, and when I need to know something, I often turn to Google. Google is the saving grace. Well, as well as YouTube. You need to know how to do something, YouTube it. I'm really surprised when students email me. It's like, I don't know, just YouTube it, figure it out. The other two reasons Kat says we turn to the media are for our personal identity and for integration and social interaction. And both of these, I think, again, are very relevant and true. The first one, personal identity. Remember, again, who we are, how we should shape ourselves, what we should look like, what things are trending, whether it's clothing or hairstyles or anything at all like that. We get all that from the media. We absolutely take on personal identity by what the media is showing and telling us, and what celebrities are doing. And when we follow that and create our own personal identity. And nowadays, the way you do happy hour is through Zoom, which is a type of media, if you will. A lot of our social interaction now happens through texting and Facebook and Instagram. It's how I keep in touch with everyone. I do not call them on the phone anymore. I absolutely text back and forth through Instagram and send reels and all that kind of good stuff. So we turn to the media for social interaction and integration. Okay. All this week about how we formulate messages, both verbally, both non-verbally, how language shapes us, and then how the messages we receive through the medium of media. And remember, media is almost anything that has to deal with this kind of computer mediated TV, phone, Zoom, social media. So you have two learning activities here. You have a uses and grats and cultivation theory. I told you about both of those, and the little compliance gaining activity I thought would be interesting for you. So there's week 3 for you. I'll be back again next week, of course. And next week, we will be in week 4. We're going to shift now to some of the different areas of communication. We've looked at the communication model from the communicator, the message, and the medium. And now we're going to go into some different areas. And we're going to start with one of my favorites, which is relational or interpersonal communication, and start looking at theories of relationships. So I will see you all next week.